What does it mean? How do you explain it all? She wanted to say, turning to Mr. Carmichael again, for the whole world seemed to have dissolved in this early morning hour into a pool of thought, a deep basin of reality, and one could almost fancy that had Mr. Carmichael spoken, for instance, a little tear would have rent the surface pool. And then something would emerge. A hand would be shoved up, a blade would be flashed. It was nonsense, of course. A curious notion came to her that he did, after all, hear the things she could not say. He was an inscrutable old man with the yellow stain on his beard and his poetry and his puzzles, sailing serenely through a world which satisfied all his wants, so that she thought he had only to put down his hand where he lay on the lawn to fish up anything he wanted. She looked at her picture. That would have been his answer, presumably. How you and I and she pass and vanish. Nothing stays, all changes. But not words, not paint, yet it would be hung in the attics, she thought. It would be rolled up and flung under a sofa, yet even so, even of a picture like that, it was true. One might say even of this scrawl, not of that actual picture perhaps, but of what it attempted, that it remained forever, she was going to say, or for the words spoken sounded even to herself too boastful to hint wordlessly. When looking at the picture, she was surprised to find that she could not see it. Her eyes were full of a hot liquid. She did not think of tears at first, which, without disturbing the firmness of her lips, made the air thick, rolled down her cheeks. She had perfect control of herself. Oh yes, in every way. Was she crying then for Mrs. Ramsay, without being aware of any unhappiness? She addressed old Mr. Carmichael again. What was it then? What did it mean? Could things thrust their hands up and grip one? Could the blade cut, the fist grasp? Was there no safety? No learning by heart of the ways of the world, no guide, no shelter, but all was miracle and leaping from the pinnacle of a tower into the air. Could it be, even for elderly people, that this was life? Startling, unexpected, unknown. For one moment she felt that if they both got up here, now on the lawn, and demanded an explanation, why was it so short, why was it so inexplicable, said it with violence, as two fully equipped human beings from whom nothing should be hid might speak, then beauty would roll itself up. The space would fill. Those empty flourishes would form into shape. If they shouted loud enough, Mrs. Ramsay would return. Mrs. Ramsay, she said aloud. Mrs. Ramsay. The tears ran down her face. McAllister's boy took one of the fish and cut a square out of its side to bait his hook with. The mutilated body, it was still alive, was thrown back into the sea. Mrs. Ramsay, Lily cried. Mrs. Ramsay, but nothing happened. The pain increased. That anguish could reduce one to such a pitch of imbecility, she thought. Anyhow, the old man had not heard her. He remained benignant, calm, if one chose to think it, sublime. Heaven be praised. No one had heard her cry that ignominious cry. Stop, pain, stop. She had not obviously taken leave of her senses. No one had seen her step off her strip of board into the waters of annihilation. She remained a skimpy old maid holding a paintbrush. And now slowly the pain of the want and the bitter anger to be called back, just as she thought she would never feel sorrow for Mrs. Ramsay again. Had she missed her among the coffee cups at breakfast? Not in the least. Lessened, and of their anguish left as antidote a relief that was balm in itself, and also, but more mysteriously, a sense of someone there, of Mrs. Ramsay, relieved for a moment of the weight that the world had put on her, staying lightly by her side, and then, for this was Mrs. Ramsay in all her beauty, raising to her forehead a wreath of white flowers with which she went. Lily squeezed her tubes again. She attacked that problem of the hedge. It was strange how clearly she saw her stepping with her usual quickness across fields, among whose folds, purplish and soft, among whose flowers, hyacinths or lilies, she vanished. It was some trick of the painter's eye, for days after she had heard of her death, she had seen her thus, putting her wreath to her forehead and going unquestioningly with her companion a shade across the fields. The sight, the phrase, had its power to console wherever she happened to be, painting here in the country or in London. The vision would come to her, and her eyes, half closing, sought something to base her vision on. She looked down the railway carriage, the omnibus, took a line from shoulder or cheek, looked at the windows opposite, at Piccadilly, lamp strung in the evening. All had been part of the fields of death, but always something. It might be a face, a voice, a paper boy crying, "Standard! News!" thrust through, snubbed her, walked her, waked her, required and got in the end an effort of attention, so that the vision must be perpetually remade. Now again, moved as she was by some instinctive need of distance and blue, she looked at the bay beneath her, making hillocks of the blue bars of the waves and stony fields of the purpler spaces. Again she was roused as usual by something incongruous. There was a brown spot in the middle of the bay. It was a boat. Yes, she realized that after a second. But whose boat? Mr. Ramsay's boat, she replied. Mr. Ramsay, the man who had marched past her with his hand raised, aloof, at the head of a procession in his beautiful boots, asking her for sympathy, which she had refused. The boat was now halfway across the bay. So fine was the morning, except for a streak of wind here and there, that the sea and sky looked all one fabric, as if sails were stuck high up in the sky, or the clouds had dropped down into a sea. A steamer far out at sea had drawn in the air a great scroll of smoke, which stayed there curving and circling decoratively, as if the air were a fine gauze which held things and kept them softly in its mesh, only gently swaying them this way and that. And as happens sometimes when the weather is very fine, the cliffs looked as if they were conscious of the ships, and the ships looked as if they were conscious of the cliffs, as if they signaled to each other some message of their own, for sometimes quite close to the shore, the lighthouse looked this morning in the haze an enormous distance away. Where are they now, Lily thought, looking out to sea. Where was he? That very old man who had gone past her silently, holding a brown paper parcel under his arm. The boat was in the middle of the bay. They don't feel a thing there, Cam thought, looking at the shore, which, rising and falling, became steadily more distant and more peaceful. Her hand cut a trail in the sea as her mind made the green swirls and streaks into patterns, and numbed and shrouded wandered in imagination in that underworld of waters where the pearls stuck in clusters to white sprays, where in the green light a change came over one's entire mind, and one's body shone half transparent, enveloped in a green cloak. Then the eddy slackened around her hand, the rush of the water ceased, the world became full of little creaking and squeaking sounds. One heard the waves breaking and flapping against the side of the boat as if they were anchored in harbor. Everything became very close to one. For the sail upon which James had his eyes fixed until it had become to him like a person whom he knew, sagged entirely. There they came to a stop, flapping about, waiting for a breeze. In the hot sun, miles from shore, miles from the lighthouse, everything in the whole world seemed to stand still. The lighthouse became immovable, and the line of the distant shore became fixed. The sun grew hotter, and everybody seemed to come very close together and to feel each other's presence, which they had almost forgotten. McAllister's fishing line went plumb down into the sea. But Mr. Ramsay went on reading with his legs curled under him. He was reading a little shiny book with covers mottled like a plover's egg. Now and again, as they hung about in that horrid calm, he turned a page, and James felt that each page was turned with a peculiar gesture aimed at him. Now assertively, now commandingly, now with the intention of making people pity him. And all the time, as his father read and turned one after another of those little pages, James kept dreading the moment when he would look up and speak sharply to him about something or other. Why were they lagging about here, he would demand, or something quite unreasonable like that. And if he does, James thought, then I shall take a knife and strike him to the heart. He had always kept this old symbol of taking a knife and striking his father to the heart. Only now, as he grew older and sat staring at his father in impotent rage, it was not him, that old man reading, whom he wanted to kill, but it was the thing that descended on him. Without his knowing it, perhaps, that fierce, sudden, black-winged harpy, with its talons and its beak all cold and hard, that struck and struck at you. He could feel the beak on his bare legs where it had struck when he was a child. and then made off, and there he was again, an old man, very sad, reading his book, that he would kill, that he would strike to the heart, whatever he did, and he might do anything, he felt, looking at the lighthouse and the distant shore. Whether he was in a business, in a bank, a barrister, a man at the head of some enterprise, that he would fight, that he would track down and stamp out. Tyranny, despotism, he called it. Making people do what they did not want to do. Cutting off their right to speak. How could any of them say, but I won't, when he said, come to the lighthouse. Do this. Fetch me that. The black wings spread, and the hard beak tore. And then next moment there he sat reading his book, and he might look up, one never knew, quite reasonably. He might talk to the McAllisters. He might be pressing a sovereign into some frozen old woman's hand in the street, James thought, and he might be shouting out at some fisherman's sports. He might be waving his arms in the air with excitement, or he might sit at the head of the table dead silent from one end of dinner to the other. Yes, thought James, while the boat slapped and dawdled there in the hot sun. There was a waste of snow and rock, very lonely and austere, and there he had come to feel quite often lately when his father said something or did something which surprised the others. There were two pairs of footprints only, his own and his father's. They alone knew each other. What then was this terror, this hatred? Turning back among the many leaves which the past had folded in him, peering into the heart of that forest where light and shade so checker each other that all shape is distorted and one blunders, now with the sun in one's eyes, now with a dark shadow, he sought an image to cool and detach and round off his feeling in a concrete shape. Suppose then that as a child sitting helpless in a perambulator or on someone's knee, he had seen a wagon crush ignorantly and innocently someone's foot. Suppose he had seen the foot first in the grass, smooth and whole, then the wheel, and the same foot, purple, crushed, but the wheel was innocent. So now when his father came striding down the passage, knocking them up early in the morning to go to the lighthouse, down it came over his foot, over Cam's foot, over anybody's foot. One sat and watched it. But whose foot was he thinking of? And in what garden did all this happen? For one had settings for these scenes. Trees that grew there, flowers, a certain light, a few figures. Everything tended to set itself in a garden where there was none of this gloom, none of this throwing of hands about. People spoke in an ordinary tone of voice. They went in and out all day long.